Every society develops its own mechanisms in terms of conflict resolution. So most parts of India had indigenous ways of dealing with conflict. I don't find it particularly useful to constantly revert back to old ways of dealing with new problems. Because what happened, for instance, a particular practice that was common in the Indus Valley civilization was not particularly useful 1,000 years later or even 200 years later. Similarly, the ways in which Indian families or Indian villages traditionally dealt with conflict even 100, 150 years ago can have few lessons, but only a few lessons for modern India in terms of dealing with its own conflicts and disputes. And there are many reasons for this. One, the world has changed phenomenally, as all of us know. Families have changed. The judiciary is the one body in the country that has been in the forefront of innovating in terms of conflict resolution processes. Some years ago, the Supreme Court actually announced that all high courts and the smaller courts would start mediation and offer mediation as an alternative to litigation, particularly in civil cases and particularly in the early stages of a case. Some of the states have made tremendous headway in mediation, and the Karnataka, the Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Delhi High Courts and a few more have full-fledged mediation programs that benefit litigants. Having said that, I believe the court can go much further in making private mediation more accessible and more popular in the country, because there's no reason why people should go into litigation at all if so many of the minor issues can be dealt with through mediation in the private sphere. This can also free up the court and the lawyers to deal with the complex judicial cases where their expertise is most needed. The other thing that the courts can do is, particularly for public disputes, they can start recommending to the government that the parties should go into dialogue or should engage in a more complex decision-making process and not take the first step of just going into the courts or trying to file a PIL, for instance. All of which is useful sometimes, but also by its very design adversarial. Now, protest and litigation have a role to play. However, when a society exclusively depends on both this, it ends up creating an extraordinarily adversarial environment in society. Think about it. It's highly unlikely that two parties who go to the court to settle a dispute, let's just say two brothers or two business partners go to the court, and a judgment is finally, after some years, handed down by the judges. It's extraordinarily unlikely that the parties will come out of the courts and go to a restaurant to have lunch together. Essentially, the judicial process does not help in rebuilding the relationship. Protest actually makes relationships tangibly worse because it's inherently adversarial. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a time and a place for protest. There's a time and a place for adversarial engagement. The way I put it, adversarial engagement is necessary and useful to get parties who are unwilling to come to the table to the table. But if the use of this is to bring parties to their knees, then the cost is extraordinarily high, because if you try to bring anybody down to their knees, they are unlikely to forgive you. And it's entirely possible that the next time they get an opportunity, they will choose to pay you back in a similar fashion. And this creates cycles of conflict. So no conflict is resolved merely because a court judgment decrees it to be so, or because a protest succeeds in arm twisting either a group or the government to do something that it would rather not do. Temporarily, the protesters may get what they want. But if you really want sustained change in society, it has to be through collaboration. This actually brings us to one of the most important aspects of the field of conflict resolution. Even though the term conflict resolution itself sounds negative, inherent in this is extraordinary optimism. It's the optimism that true cooperativeness and collaborativeness can completely change the way human beings engage with differences. And whether it's labor or management, whether it's families that are split because of the separating of assets or the partition of assets, whether it's disputes between Hindus or Muslims or Christians, it doesn't matter what it is. If you really want sustainable change and sustainable peace, it has to happen through collaboration. One of the things that we're trying to do is bring together corporations, civil society actors like NGOs and government, and do two things. One, create awareness amongst them about the possibilities inherent in dialogue, consensus building and mediation. Remember, if we look at the cost of conflict in India at large, we sometimes read about how many man-days have been lost through strikes, etc. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are very many other ways in which conflict actually affects not just individuals, emotions, relationships, it affects the bottom line. When government and civil society and businesses cannot agree on key issues related to development, the country, its growth, its development and its security even is at stake. So we are trying to actually educate people through seminars, conferences, etc. on how they can actually avail of better processes in engaging with these issues. We are also trying to do pilot studies and projects to demonstrate the efficacy of these processes. Personally, given the global climate and given the kind of stresses and strains that are affecting the Indian state and Indian society, both from within as well as from the extraordinarily turbulent neighborhood, remember Pakistan, China, Afghanistan, it doesn't get more complicated. Sometimes it can seem as though conflict resolution processes are very long drawn. I have two ways of responding to that. The first is, yes, sometimes it can take time. It doesn't mean that we can't have band-aid solutions where necessary. If the bleeding is happening, you have to first stem the bleeding in order for you to be able to address the more complex systemic issues involved. And that's perfectly fair. And as conflict resolution professionals, it's important for us to know when to apply a bandage and to stem the bleeding. The other way of responding to this is, yes, conflict resolution takes time, but conflicts, when not addressed well, can last a great deal longer.